You began to plant the seed in people's minds. But I think in the process, you did create a media image of me that's far beyond, the reality of me.
And this craving, this awful, raging, eating feeling inside. I could feel it consuming my insides. It was overwhelming me.
Hello again, guys, and welcome to Serial Killing, a podcast. My name is Elissa Kerrill, and I'm the host, the writer, the editor, all the things. Over here, we talk about all manner of true crime at this point, but we also get the whole picture to fully explore the nature versus nurture aspect of people who commit these horrible crimes. If that's your kink, then you've come to the right place. Subscribe, like, follow, listen. The listens add up, everything helps, and everything is linked in the notes. So today's podcast I decided to cover because there's been an update in the case, albeit not it is a pretty big update. It's still noteworthy, so we'll get to it. Stick around for the story in case you aren't familiar. So today's podcast will be on the Slenderman stabbing of the young Miss Payton Leitner. Most of you will be familiar with this case, and I am mostly familiar with it myself, but we have a whole new generation of true crime lovers coming into this genre, right? And we want them to be up to speed. We also have international listeners who might have heard about this case in passing and might want to know what happened. And now we also have updates, right? So let me set the scene. So I struggled with where to begin with this story, but I think we'll start with at least a very brief synopsis of the girls' backgrounds because there's nothing particularly mysterious, but we all need the context. So we'll start with the three key players. Payton Leitner is the victim, of course, and what short young life she had before that fateful day was described as average, typical, nothing to explore behind the curtain, just loving. She was a happy, healthy, sweet little girl, brunette, bubbly, kind, and always seemed to be smiling. She displayed all of those beautiful pro-social, empathetic skills that we love to see in children. And as Payton started the first few years of elementary school, she noticed another girl at her school named Morgan Geyser. This is the simplified story, of course, but sources say Payton kind of noticed that the other kids weren't playing with Morgan or interacting with her, and most acted like they didn't really even want to tolerate her. And now this was mostly due to Morgan's rather interesting, particularly young, special interests, all things horror. But honestly, same. Payton felt a bit sorry for Morgan because she felt that everyone deserved a friend, even if they were just a little different. So she decided she would befriend Morgan and get to know her, even though she herself was absolutely terrified of scary things, just really not into horror. But she wanted to help the girl, and thus a young budding friendship began. And as she began to get to know Morgan, she saw, and most others agreed, that she was a very creative little girl, also very quiet. So the girls ended fourth grade together as basically besties. And then as the girls began sixth grade, they met a new student, a girl named Anissa Wire. And she was kind of the odd kid out as well, so Payton and Morgan just naturally kind of absorbed her into their group. And the trio got along very well. For a time. But then Payton began to feel like Morgan and Anissa were kind of beginning to leave her out, sort of leave her behind. Morgan and Anissa became close just right out of the gate, so of course Payton would feel a bit hurt. Now I read that Morgan and Anissa wound up living in the same apartment complex, or at least very close neighbors, so they could hang out quite often, and this is when Anissa introduced Morgan to creepypastas. Now most of you know what that is, but many won't. Creepypasta is a website for horror. And on that website is a lot of fan fiction about horror characters and some really good short stories, basically of just completely fictional horror characters. It is, or at least was, a very wildly popular website with a lot of content creators reading the stories written there for YouTube and other platforms. Hugely popular. One such fictional character that became very popular was a creature named Slenderman. And I really want to stress this. Slenderman is completely fictional. He was created as only a photo for a contest by a guy that it got on that website, and then someone took his fictional character and created a whole story. And it was so well written that Slenderman himself nearly immediately became a cultural phenomenon. For those not watching the video, let me describe him. He is exactly as the name implies. He is very slim, very, very thin, and incredibly tall. Some tried to say that he was 15 feet tall, which is crazy, but the consensus seems to be between 6 to 7 feet tall. His skin is completely bleached paper white, and he has no face. Just perhaps some subtle shading of contour, but no face at all. He is wearing a very nice black suit. His arms are unsettlingly long. There is no voice and there is no expression. Sometimes he also has these black tentacles that come out of his back as well. Sometimes they say his arms turn into the tentacles. So what does he do that's so scary? He has selective invisibility. He can also have some control over to manipulate his shape a bit. And he has a level of mind control over others. The origin story was that children would come up missing, and possibly the last photo taken of the child will show sort of a faintly in the distance Slenderman as if he's waiting to take the child. But he also stalked adults, but not only ones who had only the ones who had some horrible tragedy in their lives, basically. His preference is to drive his victims mentally insane with the visual and audio distortion that they experience if he is anywhere near them. It's a crackling, whistling, it's awful. But he was also written to have impaled his victims onto tall trees. I don't know. Curious, remove their internal organs and bag them for reasons. But it's the madness that he wants. He drives his victims simply mad, and then they go on a killing rampage. The person that this happens to is referred to as a proxy. Now that's the important takeaway, is the idea of the proxy, that you sort of work for Slenderman in a way. Now, of course, I'm not doing the, again, fictional story any justice, but this gives you kind of an idea. So Anissa introduced Morgan to creepypastas, or fictional horror stories, and specifically Slenderman. And I remember when he entered the scene, he was so popular. They made video games about him, and PewDiePie from YouTube got famous playing games, that very game especially, and other horror games. But regardless, I remember watching PewDiePie play the Slenderman game. He had a little heart monitor in the corner. It was awesome. Regardless, Morgan simply became entranced with the imagery, right? The canon information, etc. And the two became a bit fixated on the character and the lore. Now, Payton was on the sidelines watching and listening, and she said that she was scared of all of their talk of Slenderman. But what really began to concern her was that Morgan and Anissa were beginning to speak as though they actually believed Slenderman to be a real creature. And this, of course, upset her. And then the girls began sending Payton these emails or links for her to open that took her to videos of Slenderman, trying to convince her that he was real. It really freaked her out. Naturally it would. But it was particularly with Morgan where we begin to see some concerning thought patterns. She began saying that she was able to have literal conversations with Slenderman. She believed that this was happening. Morgan began telling Payton that Slenderman was in fact stalking her and watching her through her windows at night, and this really scared Payton, bad, as it should. So Payton goes to her mom to talk to her about her concerns, and bless her mother, apparently she researched or otherwise gathered information, and then she told Payton that she had nothing whatsoever to worry about because she knew for a fact that Slenderman was not real. Solid parenting. Payton also began noticing that the girls would be really rude or mean to her, so she began distancing herself from them, only to have Anissa, once Morgan wasn't around, come up and apologize for their rude behavior. Fascinating. What Payton didn't know was that starting around December of 2013, Anissa and Morgan were plotting and planning. But at this point, that is when the tension in the group was also building. In May 2014, the girls decided to get together for Anissa's 12th birthday. Remember, these girls are just in 6th grade. They went to the local roller skating rink to start the night. After they went back to, I believe, Anissa's house, some sources kind of lean that it might be Morgan's house. I'm not sure, but they had a sleepover at one of their houses. And the girls had done this many, many times. All seemed perfectly normal. The next morning, Payton woke up and found Morgan and Anissa already up and on the computer. Once the duo again became a trio, they asked the mother if they could go outside. The mother said yes. They wanted to go to a nearby park, and since there is some safety in numbers, off they went. Once at the park that was described as heavily wooded, Morgan and Anissa talked Payton into playing a game of hide and seek. Remember, these are just children. They get to a building with restrooms, and it was said that Anissa tried to slam Payton's head into the concrete wall. Morgan would later note that this made Payton very upset. I mean, that seems an appropriate response, to be upset if a trusted friend tries to injure you. But things calmed down, and they made their way to the forest to play hide and seek. Again, Payton's young, naive. How would you believe anything other than the best in your friends, right? But things calmed down, as they do, and they made their way to the forest to play hide and seek. They have arrived amongst the trees. So Morgan is it first, right? So she will find them after Anissa and Payton go hide. As they are trying to find a good spot, Anissa told Payton to quickly lie down on the ground and that they could cover her with leaves and debris, that would be a perfect strategy. And Payton didn't think too much about it because, again, children. And so she did, while Anissa basically hung around and waited. Then Payton heard Anissa shout to Morgan, "Now go ballistic! Go crazy!" And as Anissa physically turned her body around, Morgan knelt down and said to Payton, "Don't be scared. I'm just a little kitty." And then promptly sort of jumped on top of her and pinned her down. Payton is, of course, caught off guard and completely startled and confused, as anyone would be. And then she hears Morgan whisper in her ear, "I'm sorry," and then begins stabbing her over and over with a 5-inch long knife from her own kitchen. Going for Payton's arms, her legs, her torso, her abdomen, it was brutal. At some point, Payton had managed to stand up, but after Morgan stabbed her 19 times, Anissa and Morgan told her to lie down and they would go get help. Anissa is the one that said this specifically. And as you have probably guessed, they didn't in fact go get help. They left her for dead, believing she was dead. And it didn't take long for her to know that her friends had left her. And somehow she crawled, half walked her way out of that forest and got herself positioned by a road or like a path just in time for a passerby to see her. It was a man cycling, and as soon as he laid eyes on her, he called for help. His 911 call is heartbreaking. He told the operator that she had been stabbed and that she said she was having trouble breathing and could only take shallow breaths, but she was conscious. The man asked her if she knew who did this to her, but then he told the operator that he thought she didn't want to talk because she was conserving her energy. I mean, this just makes me sick, that poor baby. But once help arrived, she didn't remember much, and of course she wouldn't. I mean, her body was probably going into shock. Again, sickening to even talk about because I'm a highly visual person and I cannot unsee that in my mind of her just laying there. It was said that the surgeons worked on her for 6 hours, trying to save her life. The extent of her injuries were very, very grave. She had a lot of internal organ damage, and one wound had passed like this major artery of her heart by, quote, the width of a human hair. She was in very bad shape, but somehow she managed to survive. Now, sources said that before the hours of surgery, she was able to identify who had done this to her, and to everyone's complete and utter shock, she identified her two 12-year-old best friends. The authorities wasted absolutely no time, and 5 hours after the attack, while poor little Payton was still in surgery, they found Anissa and Morgan. They had walked nearly 5 miles away from the scene of the crime. I guess they had also been carrying a bag with them that had the knife in it. So when asked where the girls were headed, well, they said that they were on their way to Slenderman's house, known to them as Slender Mansion. that was supposedly located in the Nicolet National Forest, some 200 or so miles from where they had been found. Someone told Payton once she woke up that the girls had been found, and thank God, right? She didn't have to be terrified that they might try to come finish the job. But once in the interview rooms of the police station, the questioning began. And now it is important that I tell you that they were interviewed without their parents or any kind of adult to supervise. And even though what they did was unbelievable, there are rules in place so that we don't get trials thrown out of court and so on, right? So regardless, during the interviews, Anissa initially asked how far she had walked because she, quote, wasn't very athletic. She didn't ask how Payton was, nothing. She wanted to know how far she had walked. But Morgan's interview was much more interesting. She said, I wanted to be locked up so that I didn't hurt her, but that time has passed. And now I'm here because we were careless. I knew this would happen. I knew we'd get in trouble. She called the plan for the attack on her beloved friend a flawless plan, right? Can you believe that? Morgan also stated that people who trust are gullible, and that's just sad. Morgan said that the last thing Payton said to her as she and Anissa were about to walk away was, I trusted you. I hate you. Then after, this is when Anissa told her that they were going to go get help, right? So Anissa said that she had slammed Payton's head into that wall at the restroom building, if you remember, because she had read on the internet that it was much easier to unalive a person who was unconscious, and if conscious, than to not look them in the eyes. A 12-year-old girl said that. But basically, Anissa and Morgan stated that they had intended on sacrificing Payton to Slenderman to appease him, to possibly become one of his proxies. Right? Remember? They said that if they made this sacrifice to him, he would allow them to live in his mansion with him. Morgan stated that this had all been Anissa's idea, that it had to happen for reasons, I guess. And again, they planned this for 6 months before they executed it. Another source said that Morgan and Anissa would whisper to each other in public and openly talk about the plan. But they changed, trigger words into code words so that no one would even know. Anissa showed some regret, but Morgan didn't seem to display any empathy at all. So they began to assess the mental health of the girls, and as it turned out, Morgan had some things going on. It was reported that Morgan admitted to having lifelong hallucinations since early childhood, and they typically included figures that she thought were ghosts, or she'd see, colors melting down the walls, and she had imaginary friends named Maggie and Sev. One recurring hallucination was a man Morgan named It, whose body she described as a color of smoke and ink. She would perceive him as standing behind her in mirrors or shifting around corners. She had herself a shadow man. Her mother described her as floridly psychotic, say that 5 times fast, which means that the person is in a state of acute psychosis with severe symptoms. Workers at the jail or the housing facility said that Morgan frequently talked to herself. She pretended to be a cat and she kept ants as pets. She reported seeing unicorns and believed she was continuing to have conversations with Slenderman and other fictional characters such as Severus Snape from Harry Potter. He's the professor with the hair kind of like mine. So after a few months, Morgan was transferred to a mental health facility, and there she was diagnosed with early onset schizophrenia. This just means that schizophrenia is not often diagnosed to someone as young as Morgan. The typical ages for schizophrenia onset are very late teens to potentially as far as the early 30s, but this isn't the be-all end-all. There are almost always anomalies in everything. She was one of them. And I found out that her father had also battled with the same illness and was hospitalized at least 4 times in his earlier teens. But the girls were tried, found guilty. Anissa was also apparently diagnosed with schizophrenia, but I have some doubts about the accuracy of that. Now, clearly I don't have all the information in front of me, nor would any of us, but it just doesn't seem likely to me. My own personal opinion, of course. She was sentenced to 25 years to life, an indeterminate sentence requiring at least 3 years confinement and involuntary treatment in a state forensic psychiatric institute followed by communal supervision until age 37. She was released in 2021 at 19 years old with a lot of very strict conditions as far as I could find. And she has followed them to a T. That's what I read. So please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. She made a statement that she hated her actions on that day, but she had forgiven herself and that she's ordered to live with her father. But what of Morgan? Well, it turns out that as of this very month, a judge has decided that Morgan has made full use of the facility and programs and therapies available to her. She had been petitioning the court for a while for her release. The judge would come back and state that she had not fully utilized her resources and hadn't fully committed to working on herself, or I couldn't figure out how to word that, but you get it. And finally, which I'm trying to not read into too terribly much, but I do find it oddly timed and a little bit sus, the judge deemed her to be not fully committed to her healing journey, right? And then Morgan comes out as a transgendered male, she's 22 now, or he, who experienced some sexual abuse as a child. And I'm sure that there's more to it than that, but now she's available for conditional release. I don't want to diminish anyone's sense of self-identity, but my gut is just kind of like, But anyway, Morgan has now had an updated diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder and not schizophrenia, which again surprises me. But their argument that a mental health hospital is not meant to house someone as a prison, and that's pretty valid. So here's waiting to see how Morgan does. And I really just hope that Payton's okay, honestly. I really do. I wish that girl all the best. You know, she was only in the hospital for like 6 or 7 days, and then she was out. She went back to school the next fall. Honestly, it's amazing to me. So tell me, guys, what do you think about this story? I remember that this was really big in the news when it happened, and then I kind of forgot about it till this update, and I went, you know what? I should probably cover that. So here we are. I hope you enjoyed. Remember, the Murder in the News series has been moved to its own podcast. It's just called Serial Killing Murder in the News. Not too terribly hard to remember. It's that same sickly green color that my thumbnail is. It's available. I made sure it's on Apple, Spotify, all the places. I'm on Audible, Amazon Music, wherever you want to listen. So thank you so much, guys. Have a great day.
Anybody who killed more than 2 or 3 people was a mass murderer. And whether it was all at one place or over an extended period of time. And then in the early 80s, they came up with this differentiation called serial killing.